Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years. Pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. This week on the podcast, I have Daniel Simpson, and this is another one of those conversations that I recorded in late December, and I've been talking about it constantly since. Daniel talks to us about praise, activism in the yoga community space, asks us to think about how we can be good citizens, even if the yogic texts don't necessarily explicitly say that, and also encourages us to entertain the idea that we might be wrong. I'm sure he wasn't talking about me, right? Anyway, that feels like a huge ask, but a worthwhile one. Now, before we begin with this discussion, will you do me a favor and follow the podcast from wherever you're listening? This tells the algorithm that people enjoy our podcast, and then it shows the podcast to more people like you. I'm a firm believer that we will make more community and impact on our industry if we are talking and connecting together. And this little thing invites more yoga professionals to join us around the water cooler. Also, if you're feeling spicy, and it is Valentine's Day week, my friends, a review of the podcast on your preferred platform also helps. So go ahead and drop those 5 stars and tell people why you love working in yoga. Before we begin, thank you as usual to Sunlight Apothecary, a regular sponsor of the podcast. We are already thinking spring in the apothecary and gathering our best teas to partner with the first flush of green. Join us for our Spring Awakening tea series online at www.thesunlightexperience.com/apothecary. Now, I promise not to make you wait any longer. Here is my interview with Daniel Simpson. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Okay, this episode today is a continuing series on our weird obsession with perfectionism within the yoga industry, and I have a new friend, Daniel Simpson, on the podcast today. Daniel, will you tell everybody who you are and what you do?
I'll try, although I don't always know myself.
Fair.
I have been a yoga practitioner, I guess inquirer in one way or another for the last 25 years or so, and more recently have specialised in the history and philosophy of yoga, which I teach at a university in London, the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and also at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. So I've become a bit of a yoga nerd professionally, although I have continued to practice, actually in terms of my own pursuit of yoga away from the classroom. But I've become more and more interested in talking about yoga and what it is we think we're doing with yoga, because I think that often just gets sort of assumed rather than interrogated.
Yeah. How did you come into your own interest in yoga?
Well, it's a long story, and the
I'm ready.
The short version is sort of by accident, by traveling to India, as I say, a bit more than 25 years ago now, as a backpacker, stumbling on both yoga classes, but also traditional yogis who were quite wild, semi-naked, dreadlocked, ash-smeared characters sitting around fires. And I ended up going in 2001 to the Kumbh Mela, the biggest gathering of people on the planet. I sort of threw my interest in trying to understand both, the world of these traditional yogis and some of the European hippies who were my parents' age, who were hanging out with them. I started to realize I needed to try and do something practically with yoga. And so after, dabbling in a bit of meditation, a bit of physical yoga practice, I got a bit more serious with that. About 20 years ago, I became a quite regular and dedicated Iyengar yoga practitioner, which got me sucked into what BKS Iyengar claimed would be the path to enlightenment. He said alignment is enlightenment, in fact. So if you could just get the postures exactly as they should be, somehow
Yes.
everything would light up like a Christmas tree. But it didn't quite work that way for me.
So that's so relatable. I 25 years ago when I started in a Iyengar studio as well. So that story is very relatable. And now I feel like this idea, this obsession we have with alignment that is just honestly perfectionism culture, like
Yes.
housed in this language of how our bodies are supposed to, and I'm using air quotes here, supposed to look in space. Over
Hmm.
your, 20 years of practice, did you find that too?
Well, yes. I think, the Iyengar tradition has, on the one hand, a lot to answer for, but also a lot to offer. I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of the ways in which yoga asana is taught in the globalized sort of postural yoga space is influenced by BKS Iyengar's obsession with where to put your body parts. And the whole idea of
Yeah,
verbal
yeah.
instruction is something that he, really refined. But, it was all with this assumption that there was some perfectible, essence, like a sort of platonic form of the posture that you could somehow
Yeah.
wring out of your body if you only did it, dedicatedly enough. But the problem always was, and this was something that's actually enshrined in the way that teachers were trained, was that nobody could do it as well as him, in his opinion. And so I
Yes.
saw him publicly shame, teachers who'd been with him for over 40 years. I'm thinking particularly of Patricia Walden, who I watched
Yes.
on stage in China, being humiliated for her inability to stand straight in Tadasana. She'd been practicing yoga for 40 odd years by this time. And it was really just, I guess, a teaching tool for him to try and say, we've got to keep inquiring into this, sort of imperfectibility of the body. But he would always sort of couch it, first of all, in the language of there being something that we could aspire to that was perfect.
Yeah.
And secondly, to really drill down into this failure on our part to manifest it. And it was said in the UK Teachers Training Guide, never praise a student, because then you're basically bigging yourself up as their teacher, saying, aren't I a great teacher? I've taught them well. Instead, only correct their mistakes. So it just had this bias towards shame and the idea that, must try harder and must push further.
That is really interesting to me. The idea that praising your student is essentially praising yourself.
Hmm.
Huh. Say more about that.
Well, it's an interesting one because Iyengar was implicitly praising himself a lot. I think he had quite
Yes.
quite a string
Yes.
of insecurities and therefore felt, he needed to try and prove himself independently. He only spent a couple of years with his guru Krishnamacharya, then was sent
Yeah.
off to fend for himself, and did develop this system by himself that led him into contact with, celebrities and even, I think, the Belgian royal family at one point. And
Yeah.
then he became a name. And so he wanted to talk about how he had improved on and perhaps even surpassed what his guru taught, and also that he was better than Patabi Joys, who he was increasingly annoyed to find people were keen
Yeah.
to go and visit to learn Ashtanga, which had all come from the same place too. So he was, full of himself on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, sort of somehow standing outside of his own rule. And the way I think he made that make sense to himself was he would always talk down to his students. So he would shame them, but there was nobody there to shame him.
I think that's very interesting. And you're correct here. One so I feel two ways about what you've just said. One is that how human of him, because it would
Yes.
be extraordinary. It takes an extraordinary person to stand in front of a room of people who have given you credit for changing your life and have that person say, "Oh no, it's not me." It's a
Yeah.
heady feeling. I mean, it's a heady feeling in a room of 5 people, let alone in a room of 500 people. But also, like, he's also a jerk. like,
Well, indeed, and in fact, he did sort of, stand on the stage and say, "Aren't I wonderful?" So he
yeah.
was somehow transcending his own categories, while also talking down to his students. So he didn't praise them, but he praised himself. So he skipped the stage that was supposedly going to lead to that fault and manifested it.
So, can we blame this perfectionism thing on Iyengar?
No, I don't think that would be
Okay.
fair. And as I say, I
Okay.
do think Iyengar has contributed a lot of very helpful things, but
Yeah.
it's often the case that sort of systems get, ossified around an idea.
Yeah.
And the idea in his system that really kind of got a little too rigid was this perfectibility of alignment. But other schools have got other ideas about what can be perfected. And I mean, just to take Ashtanga as an example that
Yeah.
came from the same source, a lot more loose in the sort of definition of what makes a perfect posture, but still very clear standards. You've got to get one right to your teacher's satisfaction before they deign to give you the next one.
Yeah.
And so there is this obsession with continually advancing, continually trying to wring more accomplishments out of the body, as if that is somehow going to lead to some deeper state of yoga, rather than either a bendier body or a
Yeah.
broken body.
Yeah. So, okay, so I'm working on this hypothesis. I have this because I feel like yoga professionals are an
Hmm.
interesting collective of people in general. Like, we tend to be pretty highly educated for the amount of training it requires for entry level
Hmm.
position in this job, right? We're really nerdy. Like, we love I can slide your book to like 20 people and they'll gobble it up in a weekend, right? And I think that there's something to this idea that somehow outside of the yoga space, we experienced and existed in a place where we were told that perfectionism, that being perfect, being right, being good, good boy, good girl, good person, um, was how we were supposed to be. And so we slid into yoga spaces, especially hatha yoga spaces where we were supposed to be perfect, where you could potentially get an A on your paper,
Yeah.
and we went, oh, it's like home. And none of us questioned.
Well, there is definitely some truth to that, I think. And as I sort of, my book, The Truth of Yoga, begins by saying that there isn't one truth.
Yeah.
I think also there isn't one person who's drawn to yoga, and I think there's a huge variety of experiences. And another one that I do think is quite common is people who are struggling in some way,
Yeah.
particularly with this relationship with themselves. So it's
Yes.
almost the flip side of what you were describing, actually a position of self-loathing and
Yeah.
sense of not being good enough, and then desperately craving that elusive pat on the head, or occasional word of praise from the teacher, in
Yeah.
order to demonstrate, I know I am worthy, or even just to encounter within ourselves the feeling of it's
Yeah.
okay being me,
Yeah.
and having to keep pushing further, like a drug addict who needs a stronger
Yeah.
hit to get the same effect, to get deeper into this sense of it's okay, because there's actually a sense that it isn't okay. And that's why we're
Yes.
running into the world of yoga. So there's those two tendencies, I think, which are sort of flip sides of each other, but there's probably plenty more.
So I'm curious why we don't talk about this more, because I feel like even the conversation itself can the lack of conversation does a disservice to ourselves and our students. Um,
Mhm.
what's with that?
Well, I think it starts, coming back to Iyengar, he had to work hard to get where he was, and he was
Yeah.
proud. And
Yeah.
also, he didn't want to lie, in the sense that
Yeah.
he knew he could do what he did better than a lot of the people who were in front of him, and I expect he didn't actually ever think he trained anybody who could do it better than him. So he would have said he was being honest. But I think for most of us, it is just this sense of we're in a position of authority when we're
Yeah.
teaching. And
Yeah.
to undermine our own authority by admitting that we don't have all the answers, we're a bit of a mess ourselves sometimes, we don't look like our Instagram feed might suggest, is
Yeah.
something that most teachers run a mile from. And in my case, I've really tried to embrace that recently, since I've been talking about ideas of yoga. Firstly, because I'm not enlightened, I'm nobody's guru. I'm just
Same.
another person with lots of questions. And so I really try to encourage people to feel like, although I'm the one perhaps at the front of the room, I'm just one of many in the room, and we're all going to learn from each other. And, I'm perfectly happy to talk about the ways in which I fall short of my aspirations, or that I
Yeah.
messed up. And, the bit of my own backstory that I didn't quite sort of delve down into was
Yeah.
through hanging out with these wild men yogis. I got confused into thinking that smoking lots of very strong hashish would get me enlightened.
Yeah.
And I became a compulsive cannabis addict, and then I eventually healed myself from a drug dependency by becoming a yoga addict, and then that led to me pushing too
Yes.
far with asana practice and hurting my body. And I've begun to talk about that and to say, this is a warning, I think, for all of us to think about, what are we doing that we're a bit too, reluctant to talk about, that hides under the radar, that is actually self-harming in some way rather
Yeah.
than self-healing. And there's so much that's going on in yoga that isn't actually in the alignment with the number one precept of ahimsa, of non-harming. There's a lot of self-harming disguised as healing. And the more
Yeah.
honest we can dare to be about that, the better the chances of eradicating it. But the more we pretend it's not there, the
Yeah.
trauma wounds will continue
Yeah.
to beget more trauma.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, and I find it interesting, and I'll speak from my own experience. So I had a fairly traumatic childhood, which is why I found myself in yoga spaces. And then as a young adult, when I had my first son, I was a single mother and I was doing all the things on my own. And instead of taking a moment to process my own experiences, I just did yoga every day, all like for every and while there is some service to that, and there are some ways where I'm like, oh, I'm so grateful that I had this practice at that time so that I could show up for my son as whole as I could have been. I also think that I did the same thing. I became a yoga addict. Like that was just, instead of sitting down to cope with what my situation was, I was just in asana every day, all day.
Oh, well, I think you're far from alone there. I think there's
Yeah,
so
it's
many
true.
people who are
It's true.
self-medicating with asana.
Yeah. But then when you start to really dive deep into the tradition of yoga, what it asks of us, it is asking us to deconstruct. And so this is something we also have to deconstruct. How do we start doing that? Other
Well,
than asking the question.
by having a conversation that
Yeah.
arises from asking questions, by thinking that it's actually worth putting time, on a studio timetable for people to come together and talk. It's
Yeah.
not going to bring as many people as a handstand workshop, for example, but it's still, really important. Yoga is inquiry, and we
Yeah.
need some kind of structure to the inquiry. And it's also, a relational process, even if traditional yogis
Yeah.
liked to try and think they could somehow escape all entanglements.
I know. Yeah.
Most of us are not trying to do that, and
No.
are really just trying to get better entangled rather than more painfully entangled.
Yeah.
So we need to talk about it. We need to talk together about it. We need to learn from one another. So having conversations is actually part of yoga.
I think that now in this, we're recording this at the end of 2023. People are listening in 2024. Now is the time for those conversations more than ever, because we've gone through 3 years of COVID. Our industry has changed dramatically. The cultural landscape of the entire world, like changes on our skin. I spoke with Michelle Cassandra Johnson recently, and she was like, you can just
Yes.
feel it in the air. And things that, so I've been on this sort of like rest and self-care and deconstruction train for a long time, and it was really lonely for a good chunk of it, right? Like I was the only one just waving out the window at everybody in my area while everyone else was in a really lovely scorpion pose. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, but what about over here? But now I find people pay me a lot of money at my studio to come sit and talk about books that have meaning, and it blows me away. Like, do you feel that too, that it's more culturally accepted that we can do this now?
I do feel that way, and that is what I've been fortunate enough to be able to do. And part of that was through this pandemic facilitated online yoga shala that
Yeah.
enabled people from all over the world to come together and speak. But where I live in a fairly remote place, it would be difficult to gather enough people together to cover the cost of hiring the hall in which we would sit. So it is still a challenge, this whole yoga industry as it is
Yeah.
to try and make things pay. And so people are often led towards what pays rather than, what is most needed and what most heals. But
Yeah.
I do agree that there is a much greater willingness to ask questions. I think also rewinding a few years before the pandemic, the whole Me Too moment and
Yeah.
interrogation of the obvious misdeeds at the very
Yes.
least, and outright abuses of many senior yoga teachers. In fact, there's almost no lineage of yoga that is untouched by this. Meant that people
Yes.
started to say, we need to really, not rip everything up and throw it away, but ask some very deep and searching questions about what we're actually doing here. How
Yeah.
much power are we giving away to, hierarchies that don't deserve it? How much are we perpetuating that through our own attitude to ourselves and to others? And what do we need to do differently? And part of that, is still to be explored, I think. But also, even more importantly, what is yoga? That's the big question. And for a lot of, most of the modern yoga practice world's experience of it, yoga has meant asana.
Yeah.
And that's what anybody in the street will assume you mean by yoga. They think yoga means doing things on mats and meditation is sitting on a cushion. But for most of the history of yoga, that's what yoga was, sitting still.
Yeah.
And even, to the point where actually the only real physical practice that's praised and said to lead you to the highest goals until very recently indeed is pranayama. So just sitting quietly, breathing, tuning into being here is actually all that yoga is. And you can do that in a wheelchair. You do not need to be in a perfect scorpion pose. And actually, even underneath everything, you're talking about sort of the undoing process almost of
Yeah.
yoga. It's unwinding all of these layers of confusion that stop us from seeing that everything is actually just okay right the way that it is.
It's
Although
true.
obviously out there in the world, there's all sorts of stuff that could use some improving, and there's all sorts of tendencies within us that could use a bit of refinement. Right at our core, there's nothing to improve. And yet at the same time, there's that paradox that if we were to just bliss
Yeah.
out on that, we'd just be damaged people acting out in this sense that we were somehow, walking
Yeah.
goddesses. And that's where all the abuse came from. So we've got to kind of hold those two things in some sort of creative tension. Everything's fine
Yeah.
just the way that it is. And yet we need to somehow work on ourselves. But that work needs to be subtle. It needs to be informed by kindness.
Yeah.
The message is the medium, or the medium is the message, so the
Yeah.
path is the way. Being kind to ourselves is how we become kinder people. And
Yeah.
beating ourselves into submission in an attempt to somehow wring perfection out of the body is not going to help when we start relating to others, because that's our
Yeah.
ingrained tendency and
Yeah.
it will carry on enacting.
Ooh, I think you've hit on something that I really like here, that tension. This tension
Hmm.
of it, and I see it and I feel it, the tension of self-improvement versus the tension of you don't need to improve. You're
Hmm.
already everything that you need. And and this is maybe a philosophy question too, because I think that
Yeah.
oftentimes we in the West are not designed to hold that both of those truths to be true at the same time. That's very difficult. I mean, I'm here in the US. It is very clearly a Judeo Christian kind of world where we have all
Sure.
grown up, and that teaches us that there is one truth. And it becomes really, really uncomfortable to sit in the fact that these two opposite things could be true at the same time. How do you how do you work around that tension?
Well, one very clear statement that I think is quite helpful to come back to is there in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. Everybody knows the sutra about sthira sukhamasana. You need to be in a
Yeah.
steady and comfortable pose.
Yeah.
Less of us talk about the next one, which says you get into that steady, comfortable pose by letting go of effort and getting absorbed in meditation. And even fewer talk about the fruit of that, which is the 48th Sutra of the Sadhanapada, the second chapter of the text, which says, from there you are no longer troubled by the dualities of opposites.
Yeah.
And that's actually very specific. It's the commentaries over the centuries have explained that's about being so absorbed in your meditation that you don't care about being in discomfort, and that's the source of the steady comfort.
Yeah.
You're just
Yeah.
you're somewhere else. But actually, also, it's a reminder that yoga is about the integration of opposites, the transcendence of opposites,
Yes.
the ability to hold these things in creative tension. Patanjali says the way to still your mind is this balance of abhyasa and vairagya. So basically, making an effort and letting go. It's kind of,
Yeah.
how do you do both of those at once? So it's a walking contradiction, yoga philosophy, in a way, and it's designed almost like a Zen koan to deconstruct the mind. The whole
Yeah.
problem of yoga is the tendencies in our minds that lead us to act in unhelpful ways. So yes, we might at our core be perfect, but unless we do some spring cleaning, that perfection does not manifest. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, so much that, in fact, that is in my mind, and we all teach differently, but when I teach asana, I teach for that purpose. I purposely will put people in positions and be like, is your body going up? Is it going down? Look, you can be both things at the same time. That can be true for your physical body, that can be true for your brain, that can be true for life.
Hmm.
That's the part where actually I like asana. Asana makes it really tactile. You can touch that concept, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um, I want you to say a little bit more about duality because there is discomfort there. Do you mind? Go.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
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 yeah. I mean, I think there's this obsession in the yoga world. It all comes from this idea. Yoga means union, so everything
yes,
is about the oneness. Let's all bliss out. We are all one. It
yeah,
sounds lovely. John Lennon's Imagine starts, strumming away in
yes,
the background. But let's actually get down to brass tacks. If all things are one, I am you as you are me, etc. I am the walrus. I've
yeah,
got a Beatles theme going on in my
yeah,
head today. But yeah, then how do we have relationships if it's all the same thing underneath?
yeah,
That might be the ultimate truth in one way of seeing, but it sort of jumps to the highest level. And in day-to-day reality, there is distinction. And
yeah,
actually, the cultivation of a skillful mind requires distinctions. We need to have a spectrum which is created by two poles that are opposites. Basically, the simplest version of this is suffering and the
yeah,
removal of suffering. Am I
yes,
going towards more suffering or am I going towards removing suffering? Very few of us are at either end of that spectrum, lost forever in suffering or liberated.
yeah,
So most of us are just having to orient ourselves somewhere on that pole. And we then have to find all of the other different ways in which we're somewhere in the middle of lots of different, extremes. And once we've got that, then we can navigate away from one and towards the other, but also knowing that there's nothing to get attached to at the other end of the extremes. It's just a way of reconciling, and it all comes down in the end to not wanting anything. And this is the problem, I think, for Western
yeah,
culture. We're so
yes.
steeped in the
Ooh,
idea of
yes. More,
me,
more.
mine, what
Yeah,
I need. And the liberation in yoga is liberation from wanting anything. You're
yeah,
okay with everything just as it is, even the fact that the world is terrible. And what we need, I think, for the 21st century is a yoga philosophy that builds on the old yoga philosophy, which is pretty much where things stopped, saying, make your peace with reality as it is, whether you go for the dualistic yoga philosophy approach, the non-duality approach, which means just blissing out forever, at one with the
yeah,
universe. They both basically stop there. They don't say, now, having got to that realization, become a good citizen. The Bhagavad
yeah,
Gita does that, but that's got its own strange history. And it's really a very rare example of talking about, activity in the world is the highest manifestation of this understanding. And I think we need to develop our own version of that really says what we're trying to do here is to become more skillful in life, which means in relationships, which means
yeah,
understanding differences, accepting, this full spectrum diversity that's out there, and
yeah,
not trying to collapse it all into the same thing.
yeah,
And learning how to navigate. And for that, we need our own map and compass. And so we really need our own philosophy that sort of applies these basic principles to the actual realities of day-to-day life, and perhaps enables us to say the highest aspiration of yoga is to work for the alleviation of everybody else's suffering, like the
yeah,
Bodhisattva vow of the Mahayana Buddhists. But there is no yoga text that actually says that. The Bhagavad Gita borrows some of that idea from Buddhist traditions, but it doesn't really give it quite the same full force expression. So a lot of us assume that's what yoga philosophy says, but we can't find old texts that put it that way because that's not really what they were written for. They were for the perfection of the process of getting out of this trap of being a human. And most of us are quite
yeah.
keen to carry on in the world of being a human for the rest of this lifetime, perhaps just a little less trapped in the unhelpful manifestations of it. So we really need to
Yeah.
refine our own way of making this stuff make sense, which is where we come back to having conversations.
Yeah, I want you to write that text. I I
Well,
really do.
I keep threatening to, but I honestly think we all need to write our own because I'll be writing from my perspective, and that's where the duality
Yeah.
really comes in. It's actually the level that there are so many possible ways of seeing, as many as there are people. And although we can have our, sort of sense that there's a higher perspective into which we can all sort of incorporate our bigger picture perspective, we're still living for most of the time in that limited here I am worldview. And so we need our own way of navigating between those two worldviews for starters, because we've got to
Yeah.
find our own way back up into the big picture. And somehow, therefore, it's for us to inquire. Otherwise, we're just following somebody else's instructions, and that's not really yoga. That's rote learning.
Yeah, that's okay. That's really fascinating because also other liberation cultures, again, I'm in the US, so think like Black liberation culture talks about the
Mm,
same thing about how liberation comes through collective activity. This idea that we are ourselves, but all we are having an individual experience in a collective space, right? And we
yes.
have to be doing both of those things. Actually, okay, so this is really funny you said that because I just said this in my yoga class last week. Is that how I find it very interesting, and I believe a skilled teacher has the opportunity to present this to their students, that we can acknowledge you're having an individual experience as a yoga student and also a collective experience in a group asana class,
Mm,
and the teacher is navigating that for everybody. Like, I can get everybody to feel a particular way based on how I've moved you and told you to breathe, but also you're having this individual experience as well. And there is something interesting that I find interesting to explore in even our asana classes, that I think we can do that. And
mm.
do you see that as well?
Absolutely. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that doing things with the body is very accessible to people. And it's
Yeah.
also an accessible way of engaging with these subtler ideas that can otherwise sound very abstract. And I
Yeah.
think another way into that is also to think, rather than yoga as the sort of umbrella term for what we're doing, to go back to the real sort of, I guess, Indian umbrella term for everything that we're talking about now, which is dharma, which is about the right
Yeah.
thing to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't want to live in a world where somebody says there is only one right thing to do and they wag their finger and they tell me. I want to live in a world where it's up to me to try and figure out, in accordance with some basic principles, how I, in my own circumstances, do my best to manifest that, and accept also that there are other legitimate ways of coming to a different conclusion. And that's what we're
Yeah.
doing in our own bodies. We've got a general framework for, there's a class going on here. It's not just roll around on the floor and do whatever you feel like. We've got some pointers, but there'll be lots of different ways to interpret what we do with those things. And that's where I think,
Ooh.
how to live in the world comes into its own.
Yeah, that's going to be the clip for this podcast, by the way. What you just said, I just heard it. This because I also don't want to live in a world where somebody else is wagging their finger at me and telling me what I'm supposed to be doing in order to be a good person.
No.
I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church. I've done that. It wasn't for me. um, and we do that though within the yoga space. There's that
100%.
perfectionism thing rearing its ugly head again. That person saying, but you're not
It
yoga
also,
unless.
well, exactly. Yeah. And that's why I do think it's helpful to ask the what is yoga question, but to hold the answer lightly. It's a provisional answer. It's what works for us at the moment. It's not, the defining principle that we can etch in stone and then go around with our little flashing blue light being the yoga police and telling other people off for not
Yes.
living in accordance with. And there's so much of that now, not just in the yoga space, but more broadly in the
Yeah.
activist world, which has informed a lot of this thinking in yoga land.
Yes.
That is about, we've got the right answer. People who don't sign up to the program are the enemy. And
Yes.
firstly, that doesn't tend to get those who don't sign up already to sign up. Secondly,
No.
though, it doesn't adhere to that basic principle we just talked about, that none of us want to live in a world where we're told what to do. So there needs to be space for critical thinking, for inquiry, for there to be perhaps two truths that are in tension, as we've already talked about.
Yeah.
Depending on where you're situated, you will see things differently, and it's okay. And there is a way that we can hold both of those truths together in a bigger truth of respect and acceptance and provision of circumstances whereby everybody can flourish, hopefully, although so many
Yes.
forces out there don't seem to think that way. But nonetheless, that's what we're trying to create in a yoga class, for example. And
Yeah.
that can be a crucible for forging a way of being that we can take outside the class.
Yeah. Ooh, I love that you mentioned that this is very true, not only in the yoga space, but in the activist space, because I do think that activist space has influenced us within the yoga paradigm, within the yoga industry. And
Totally.
what I find very frustrating, because, and I will say full on, I own a studio and I advertise to the activists in my own community, and a lot of them come and practice at our space. And what drives us all nuts is how that conversation happens. We're just like, God, you're our people, but you're driving us all crazy. Stop it. Like,
Well,
which
good
is,
that you see it and call it for what it is. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's almost worse than arguing with somebody who has the opposite opinion of you. Like, you're my people and I still want to argue with you. Like,
Well, now we're back to the perfectionism again, because
it's
it's the
true.
narcissism of small differences.
Yes.
There's no bigger enemy than the person who thinks almost like you, but just there's a little bit different.
Oh, that is a very good. Say more about that.
Well, I guess we see it all over the place. But I mean, the classic example, which everybody recognizes when they look at it, is summed up in Monty Python's Life of Brian, where these rebellious protesters are arguing amongst themselves about, the Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea. I mean, obviously, given what's going on in the Middle East, it's perhaps not the moment to make a light of any of that. But still, it shows that within movements doing their utmost to resist injustice, there is this burning sense of absolute certainty about what the right thing to do is, and that
Yeah.
deviators from that are the ones who are undermining the zeal that's required to see it through, because you have the weight of the odds stacked against you, so you feel like you're being weakened from within. And resistance movements have actually often cannibalized themselves through this
Yes.
factional kind of strife that builds up, instead of coming together. Whereas often, it's another sort of stock joke in a way, but the people on the right will, I mean, left and right don't really mean much anymore, but
No.
nonetheless, let's just use that phrase for the sake of argument. We'll often just club together as a good
Yeah.
way of, whatever the current jargon is, owning the libs, because if we all pile on, then we achieve greater force in numbers. And that mentality isn't there amongst those who are really trying to perfect the world, to make progress in the world, to
Yeah.
improve the world, for the sake of the benefit of many rather than just themselves. And there's a righteousness that creeps in there that makes it quite difficult to
Yeah.
listen to challenge. And it requires us all actually to do what yoga philosophy is telling us to do, which is to stop getting so hung up on me and the idea that I
Yeah.
got all the answers and you should listen to me. And instead to be open to the fact that, really, as one of my teachers put it, I might be wrong. And I think
Yeah.
that's the most helpful mantra that I've ever come across in the last 5 years of talking about yoga philosophy
Yeah.
in a big way. It's remembering I might be wrong, and to keep all answers provisional.
Yeah. You remind me very much of my friend Coley. She's a DEI educator here in the States, and she always, so her job is to navigate people who are having these conversations. And she always reminds me, because I like to be right, and I know that I'm not alone in that, but it's
Oh,
enjoyable
me
when I'm
too. I
right.
mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I have
But
to
she's
keep
a
reminding myself to let go.
yeah. Like, she'll be like, lean into the relationship. Are you speaking with somebody who is a relationship that you value? Lean into that versus, and just like you said earlier, have conversations with people versus having like soliloquies where they're watching you and you're just up on the stage. And we
Well,
have a lot of
exactly.
like single player soliloquy people here within the industry. How do we shift to collective conversation? Because we can't go to a place. We don't have like a place where all the yoga people go. And you can, so I can say, hi, Daniel, it's nice to see you in person. Like, we don't have that.
No, and that's what some of these sort of yoga, let's say, industry bodies are supposed to be there for, but really they've got other functions. They're, glorified telephone directories, or they're,
Yes.
mechanisms for selling training programs or whatever they might be, even when they do have nobler aspirations. So they're never going to bring everyone together, and also everybody's spread out, even if we can come together
Yeah.
online. Um, so I think the place we end up going back to is yoga texts. And
Yeah.
my favorite place to point to when thinking about this is in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Um, I think verses 20 to 22. The 22nd verse, if I remember rightly, forgive me if
Yeah.
I've slipped up, talks about knowledge that is tamasic, that is, dull-minded and potentially ignorant. And that's knowledge that fixates on just one way of seeing. And that's what we see so much of these days. The previous verse is talking about knowledge that is rajasic, which is,
Yeah.
caught up in debate between different perspectives. So it's sort of effectively acknowledging that there are different ways of seeing, but they're sort of at loggerheads. They need to fight for the right to have their space. And
Yeah.
then before that, there is the sattvic way of seeing, which is actually rooted in the understanding that there is this sort of commonality in all experience. The same self is in all beings. And yet at the same time, there is this unity in the diversity that allows for all these other points of view, and that there is therefore a way of seeing and being that can embrace that degree of difference without, turning it into a big fight over who's right, while still at the same time tuning in to this nobler aspiration of, coming together in some way. Now, obviously, what form that takes in the real world is what we have
Yeah.
to decide for ourselves. There is no blueprint, otherwise we're back to following orders. But there is that sort of
Yeah.
conceptual blueprint. How do I expand my perspective so that I listen as well as just waiting to speak, and so
Yeah.
that I tune in to this idea of us, this bigger collective way of
Yeah.
being, rather than me and my concerns. And then we're doing yoga philosophy, I think. So that's a really helpful way
Yeah.
of just sort of seeing there's a hierarchy of knowledge, and the place that we most often get stuck is really, this dull-minded fixation on our way of seeing. And the more we
Yeah.
can see that, the easier it gets to spot that's what we're doing, and then we can just take a deep breath, let go, and relax.
Yeah.
And if we could perfect that, I think that would be a great thing. But there's less where people tend to look. I mean, in the Buddhist tradition, there's a whole list of perfections, which are all about, perfection of
Yeah.
wisdom, really. And so starting with generosity. And
Yeah.
these are very, very old ideas. 100 years ago, T.S. Eliot, in his poem *The Wasteland*, he
Yes.
concludes the whole thing with 3 words from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the oldest Upanishad, that are promoting really the 3 foundational qualities of living a good life, being a good person, living in accordance with Dharma. And they are generosity, compassion, and restraint. And all of them require us to think about something more than us. How do you restrain yourself except in relation to others? How do you give unless there are others to give to? What is compassion
Yeah.
if not, an understanding of how we're relating? So these are tools that are there, that are very old. They're very well established. They form the bedrock of what gets called the Sanatana Dharma, the timeless, right way of behaving that is common not just to Hinduism, although some say that's the true name of Hinduism. They're
Yeah.
not right. It's also there in Buddhist tradition. It's a universal sense that there's this golden rule: do unto others as
Yeah.
you'd have them do unto you. It's a very basic idea. And so we can think about that, I think, through looking at the way that we relate to knowledge and, our rightness. And it's always a good opportunity to spot when we think we're right, and we're getting that burning sense of, haven't I done good by telling somebody they're wrong? That's the time
Yeah.
to check out, reflect, think, maybe actually make some amends and learn something.
So, in the yoga space, how do we do this in a very, like, I'm a tactile person, right? Like I want to, like, while I love to think, I also want to think in accordance with, we're thinking so we can act, right? I'm an action oriented human. So how do we build this into a yoga studio? We have conversations with people, as you said earlier.
Mm.
How else do we do, what other ways can we do that? What steps could we take?
Well, I suppose, dethroning any
Mm,
individual or
yeah.
text or tradition from,
Yeah.
being center stage, and acknowledging this plurality of influences, including, influences that don't come from Indian tradition. And, the modern yoga
Yeah.
world's full of them, and
Yeah.
starting to see that then, we're co-creators in a process. And that's
Mm,
part of even, how you might sequence a class. And so it can be part of teacher training to think about our own agency here. And this is the antidote to, the current fixation on the concept of cultural appropriation. Of course, we're appropriating. It's
yeah.
what people do.
Of
It's how
course.
cultures
Of
evolve.
course.
It's how
Yes.
mindfully we're doing it, and whether or not we're doing it disrespectfully and deliberately
Yes.
causing harm that's the
Yes.
problem. So the more we think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, the more we're engaging in this, and that can be applied to anything. And whether it's actually your own practice, so some more invitational way of sort of presenting yoga class that isn't just follow the instructions and is more inquiry based, without just giving it all over to the students, say do what you want for 90 minutes and I'll call shavasana at the end.
Yeah.
And then it's also there perhaps in the idea that we might even set homework that is about go away with this theme that you try to find a way of exploring for yourself physically, mentally, and we might say spiritually. So perhaps encouraging people to keep a little practice journal in which you write one sentence even about what's coming up for you in relation to this pointer, whether it's to do with what you do with the body or how you behave outside of yoga practice or whatever it might be. There's something that gives people a little bit more, I guess, involvement in this direction of their own inquiry, rather than thinking they come to class to get all the goodies. And really, yoga class, obviously, again, this is heresy in the yoga industry. Yoga class ought to be a training in how to not come back to class.
Yes. 100%. I mean, they're going to come back anyway, but
sure, and that's a nice thing, because we all need a top up and we need a reminder, and that's what teachers are for. But the point is to keep sort of pushing a little bit more. Sort of, that's not really like pushing is maybe the wrong metaphor, but there does have to be yoga has to get us out of our comfort zone. So part of that comfort zone that we're in is sitting there, please tell me what to do, teacher, while also being really averse to being told what to do. So we have to be encouraged, urged to just take a few more steps. And that is how you get someone to ride a bike. You stand behind them, you put the training wheels on, and eventually you're not holding their back, they're off. And they come back and need the same steps again and again before they get it and take off the training wheels and are away. But once you learn the skill, you can ride a bike. Doesn't mean there's no point going on a bike ride with other people, or perhaps even going to see a coach to talk about technique. But in the end, yoga teaching is something that's really just facilitation, and it's facilitating an experience, but at the same time, that experience is something that we're all having for ourselves. Nobody's giving it to us. We're giving it to ourselves by actually engaging with reality rather than checking out.
Okay. I'm gonna okay, you're my favorite person now. I'll before I just sit here and go, oh my God, I agree with everything you just said. How do people find out how to learn from you, how to read your books? Tell people contact information.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I wrote this book, The Truth of Yoga, which was my attempt to sum up, everything a yoga teacher really should know about history and philosophy, based on my own studies and inquiry and what led me into teaching these subjects. And so I also have a website, truthofyoga.com, where I offer online courses on the major yoga texts, and also some of the scholarly work that's gone on in the last decade or so that's helped us to understand a lot more about how yoga has evolved and is in constant evolution, and we are part of that process. So those are the two best places to go to start with. But also, I have a podcast, Ancient Futures, which you can find on all platforms, where I talk to people about how these ideas from yoga philosophy and related traditions are still relevant, but also how other ways of seeing are relevant. I don't just talk to yoga people. I talk to people involved in psychedelic therapy, Buddhist practitioners, Christians, people who've got nothing to do with this world in any way, shape, or form, but are engaged in creatively rethinking something. Anything that's encouraging us to think for ourselves is what I'm into. So that's probably a good place to go if you like chats. There's already about 22 at the time of recording of those out in the world, and there will be more. So that's another place to go, and that's hosted on the Substack platform, where I also publish essays. So ancientfutures.substack.com.
I'm gonna subscribe right now.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. This was such a good conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining me in this discussion. Here are my key takeaways. First, is praising our students just a version of praising yourself? This is an interesting train of thought, and I'm curious of what you think about it. I had a good long reflection about this after my conversation with Daniel, and I realized that I've never been much into praising my students, but I do really love telling them that they're great. What about you? Are you a praise teacher? Do you like being praised as a student? Next, if we're all one, how do we have relationships with each other? There's something I really want to highlight about that question because I actually talk to a lot of folks about how to use yoga philosophy and lifestyle principles to connect with other people. I think our relationships, and I mean of all kinds, I'm not just talking about romantic relationships, are some of the most meaningful and nurturing experiences that we can have in our lives, and there's a lot of data to support that claim. Have you read The Good Life by Drs. Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz? If you're curious to explore more about the science behind this topic, this is a good and fairly easy read. Next, liberation from yoga is liberation from wanting anything. I don't have anything to add here, but I really wanted to highlight that Daniel said that quote. It's one of my favorites. Next, we can develop an understanding that while yoga texts ask us to become better versions of ourselves, we can also take this knowledge and become better citizens in the world. I love this idea that Daniel puts forth to us. Can we expand our understanding of liberation to also understand our relationships with each other and our greater communities? Next, we have to find our own way to acknowledge our individual experience within a collective experience. As I talked about in the chat, I use this concept very directly while teaching yoga asana classes. I build in time within my classes where my students have the opportunity to answer the call of what their own body and experience needs. And there's also times in that same class where we come together to have a collective experience. Nervous system co-regulation is a pretty magical thing for creating the collective experience. And it is your job as a yoga professional to remind our students to also answer that individual call as well. Next, stop getting so hung up on the me and instead be open to the idea that I might be wrong. I'm going to be honest, I'm going to work on this one probably for the rest of my life, and I know a lot of us out there feel the same way. And finally, I referenced my friend Coley Sanders, who does DEI work both within the yoga space and also in the greater world for educational institutions and companies. And I convinced her to come on the podcast at the end of this season to talk about being the perfect activist. That's a myth, right? Well, Coley shares it all. She covers a deep dive into white supremacy, patriarchy, and we even talk about an episode of Friends referencing white women's hair that honestly makes me seriously uncomfortable. So I can't wait to share that conversation with you. Up next week, I get to talk to another one of my yoga world favorites. Steph Galante is back with us in the podcast. Steph does self-care work for activists and liberation seekers. And we talk about our perfectionist journey, if alignment is dressed up perfectionism, and more. I can't wait for you to listen. I'm so grateful that you took time to listen to the podcast today, my friends, and I will catch you next week around the water cooler.